The characters who populate Dark's 6 timelines, 3 worlds, and basically single-family tree are relentlessly existential. By this, I don't mean that they're necessarily well-read in existentialist philosophy, although some characters might give you that impression.
Da draußen ist nur Chaos. Schmerz und Chaos.
Rather, the characters are constantly confronted by their older and younger selves, by the aging of their children, and the inevitability of their own demise. Dark casts into sharp relief how our regrets continue to hound and haunt us, how mistakes reverberate throughout generations, and how desire, not anything so naive as free will, is the ultimate master of our fate.
Ist hier falsch, ja?
The German philosopher Martin Heidegger theorized that the primary distinction between human beings and all other beings is that human beings alone operate in the world with an understanding, a consciousness of what it means to be. That is, not only is the human being aware of its own existence, but, as Heidegger put it, in its very being, that being is an issue for it. We are unable to simply exist. Instead, we strive to make the world and our place in it knowable and meaningful. Tannhaus, the clockmaker, best exemplifies this position when he is constructing the time machine that will ultimately lead to all of the suffering we see throughout the series.
Ist diese Hartnäckigkeit in unserem Streben nicht das, was uns vom Tier unterscheidet, das nur kurzfristiges Begehren kennt? Und liegt nicht jeder Fortschritt durch alle Zeiten in diesem unstillbaren Akt des Wollens?
This striving might appear noble, but we know that it was precisely Tannhaus's inability to reckon with the death of his family, and by extension to face the inevitability of the loss of life itself, which birthed an endless cycle of death and despair. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. In this video, I'd like to examine how Dark uses time travel to confront these fundamental questions of the self, death, and desire. I'm not really interested in the workings or rules of Dark's take on time travel, so much as what this depiction of time travel reveals to us about the human condition. Heidegger's term for human existence is Dasein, best conveyed as being there. Being there means that our existence is always already conditioned by the world in which we find ourselves. Or as Heidegger puts it, it is not the case that man is, and then has, by way of an extra, a relationship of being towards the world. No one simply exists. We are thrown into a world. A world full of relationalities and linkages that we can barely begin to grasp.
Alles ist miteinander verbunden.
As we discover in Season 3, virtually all of the incestuous relationships between the characters stem from the existence of Jonas and Marta's child, whom I call Cain, due to him being born of Adam and Eve and bearing a peculiar mark. But all throughout the series, we are treated to the spectacle of vast charts and webs of intersecting lives. Not only are these useful to the viewer, but their presence belies an obsession harbored by the time-traveling residents of Winden to map out the interconnecting threads which bind them to everyone else. After all, the verb winden in German means to wind, twist, or writhe in agony. To know one's place in a system is in some sense to know where one belongs, and what path one's life should take. But these trees and webs also signify a darker truth. The fact that so much in our lives is not chosen, but merely appears as given, as a fate which we cannot reject. Nowhere is that more apparent than in Dark's treatment of family. The show is fond of saying that the future can also influence the past, and we see this play out literally, but what metaphor is being made concrete here? One way to think about this is to understand that as we age, we gain new perspective about our past actions and those of our family members. But as we do so, do we also become different people? Here, Dark puts forth a radical almost terrifying vision of empathy. For Claudia, the perspective afforded to her by time travel instills a desire to right the personal wrongs she has done to those closest to her. She tries to comfort those she has hurt, but as she is displaced from the moment of that pain, her efforts fail. She experiences alienation from those she wishes to keep a hold of the most. But for Jonas, the central drama is to determine what traumatic events could possibly transform him into the monster who stands before him, declaring,
Ich bin du.
the pain that Adam has endured and inflicted is unimaginable to Jonas, and therefore he rejects its possibility at all. But Adam knows this because he has felt it before, an infinitude of times. When I say radical empathy, think of how Dark makes us empathize with Ulrich, an adulterer and attempted child murderer, by constantly tormenting him with the possibility of a free life with his family again. Or Helga, who is never given a chance to change his fate, but who still tries to stop himself despite already knowing he'll fail. Or think of the final meeting between Jonas and Hannah. Her death is a tragedy precisely because we have witnessed all her duplicity and selfishness, but in the moment she returns to Jonas as a mother, she's killed. The scene marks Jonas's definitive transformation from Jonas into Adam. And yet, we remember that to Jonas, Hannah represents everything cruel about the world. We imagine that as Hannah dies, so too does the last piece of Jonas, as he thinks of his father who was never truly loved, never truly at home in the world. What each of these situations have in common is the presence of perspective, or a lack thereof.
My only aim is to take many lives. The more, the better I feel.
Was hat das zu bedeuten?
Das bedeutet, dass du Trottel immer noch nichts verstanden hast.
Perspective means understanding the given factors that go into a person's decisions, and how those decisions add up and are integrated into a life course.
Wenn wir doch in Wirklichkeit alle nur Bruchteile eines unendlichen Ganzen sind.
And naturally, how all of this is predetermined by one's circumstances and time. One awkward situation that so many characters find themselves in is having to ask a confused bystander,
Entschuldigen Sie die Frage. Aber welches Jahr haben wir?
Aber welches Jahr denn? Ich meine, welches Jahr?
why are we so taken aback when this is asked? Well, one primary theme of Dark is confronting the uncanny, what Heidegger calls das Nicht-Zuhause-Sein, not being at home. Home in Dark is a place to which Jonas perpetually strives to return, but here home is not so much a physical place as an entire temporal world, a whole way of being.
Ich will wissen, wie ich wieder nach Hause komme.
When Jonas speaks of home, he is not thinking about the house where his father committed suicide, but of the summer at the lake, a world without mystery before his first life ended with the loss of naivete, a quiet life. The quest to bring Mikkel home at the start of the series is one of the first times Dark uses a classic trope of time travel, here a variant of the grandfather paradox, to make an insight into humanity. Yes, Jonas would cease to exist if Mikkel were rescued, but more than this, Jonas must confront the uncanny image of his own father, projected backwards in time in the form of a child. Jonas, having already undergone a breakdown trying to reckon with his father's suicide, must here reckon with that death yet again. This is an anxiety that stems from a sense of displacement. Jonas is unable to recognize himself and his father in a world in which they do not belong.
Ultimate Fistbump?
Mikkel's whole life has collapsed before our eyes, and we understand why he was dressed as a skeleton that fateful night. He, like all of us, was marked for death from the very beginning.
Gott ist Zeit. Und die Zeit ist nicht barmherzig. Wir werden geboren und schon rinnt unser Leben dahin wie die Körner in dieser Sanduhr. Den Tod immer unausweichlich vor uns. Unser Schicksal nichts als eine Verkettung von Ursache und Wirkung.
In this scene, our resident philosopher Adam is channeling Heidegger's concept of Sein zum Tode, or being towards death. We can never experience our own deaths as an event because we will not exist to perceive it. This is why death is for us the possibility of the impossibility of any existence at all. We will never experience it, but its imminence shapes our entire lives.
Der Tod ist etwas Unbegreifliches.
Instead, we live our lives in the shadow death casts over us from some time that is yet to come. It is worth noting that this is possibly a more accurate rendering of the German word for future, die Zukunft, which dissected as Zukunft literally means that to come. In this sense, the future in Dark is always bearing down on the characters. It has a velocity which cannot be outmaneuvered. But besides showcasing the inevitable casting back of our deaths through time, Dark uses the media of montage and photography to emphasize the fragility of our temporal existence and our closeness to others. Yep, you guessed it, Heidegger has a word for this too, Entfernung, or disseverance. In essence, it is the contradictory sense in which, by recognizing our distance to someone else, we have in fact brought them closer to ourselves as human beings. It is empathy through the acknowledgement of remoteness.
Eltern, Kinder, sie alle laufen nur einen Teil ihres Lebens einen gemeinsamen Weg. Am Ende sind sie meilenweit voneinander entfernt.
Remember what I said about Mikkel's life collapsing before our eyes? This happens to so many characters throughout the series. Think of Katerina, discovering Mikkel's class picture at her school and realizing all at once that her son was by her side her whole life. Or Claudia traveling to the future to see her daughter, who was moments before a typical teenager, now dying of cancer. Time travel collapses space and time such that we can apprehend the whole tragic shape of a person's life in the blink of an eye. If you've ever looked at a photograph of your grandparents when they were kids, you know this feeling of disseverance. Somewhere between the capture of that moment and now, a whole life was lived, with all its joyous and cruel serendipities. And in the montages of Dark, we see this collapse in full force. We see far-flung characters united by the adjacency of the screen while separated by decades. Mothers torn from sons. The same pain, then brotherly, now fatherly, stamped on Ulrich's longing gaze. We see characters at their highest and lowest. We see them alive and dead, in ecstasy and in suffering simultaneously. And we even see the same person across different worlds. The difference is superficial, but the similarity is overwhelming, reminding us that somehow and somewhen, the fate that has been rushing toward us from the future will announce its arrival. Finally, Dark uses the classic problems of free will posed by time travel narratives to make a statement about what drives human beings to act the way they do.
Der Mensch ist ein eigenartiges Geschöpf. All sein Handeln ist motiviert aus Verlangen, sein Charakter geschmiedet aus Schmerz.
This is my favorite scene in the show because it encapsulates all of the themes I've just laid out. As Adam waxes about how we are slaves to our desires and pain, we see the inhabitants of Winden longing for their objects of desire across time and space. Desire is both the bridge and the gap that itself must be bridged. It tells us what to desire, but not how to attain it. As several characters over the course of Dark put it,
Der Mensch kann zwar tun, was will, aber kann nicht wollen, was will.
the tragic perversity of Dark lies in how its characters constantly thwart their own desires in an effort to either safeguard their futures or secure some further desire which they promise their younger self will want. Consider how the stranger refuses to free Jonas from the time machine because doing so would not allow the stranger to prevent the apocalypse, which, of course, he causes in the first place. Or how Noah won't warn his younger self about Adam, even though he will be immediately killed in their confrontation. Adam kills Marta, and Marta, under her own guidance, kills Jonas. The broader workings of fate certainly play a role in the tragedy of all these stories, but primarily it is ourselves, with all our short-sightedness and caprice, who undo the workings of our own happiness. Much has been made of the incestuous thicket out of which romances blossom in the town of Vinden, but I read this tangled family tree as a commentary on the always taboo character of desire itself. We will always want what's just beyond our grasp, the portion that has been set aside for another. When Hannah can't have Ulrich, she goes after his son, and then his nemesis. When Ulrich is bored of his wife, he goes after Hannah, and after her, Charlotte. Desire is a moving target, a carrot on a stick where we aren't even aware that we're the ones leading us on.
Ich liebe dich. Hannah. Bleib! Ich liebe dich! Du Scheiß! Fotze! Bleib! Bleib bei mir!
Dark makes the case that we are at once enslaved by our desires and driven by the idea that we are free to make our own choices. The sum total of our striving and strife amounts to this. Without the sense that we are masters of our own fate, we would all fall into despair. Adam and Eva represent the two responses one could have after being disillusioned of this notion. Adam is total annihilation, darkness.
Sigmundus, der alte Tannhaus, hat fest daran geglaubt, ein Paradies zu erschaffen, in dem wir frei sind von unserem Schicksal und frei sind von Schmerz. Aber ich habe endlich begriffen, was das Paradies wirklich ist. Unendliche Dunkelheit, in der nichts existiert.
For him, life is not worth the price that must be paid in pain. Eva is the opposite. Unlike Adam, she has no plan to exit the loop. Her entire goal is the infinite perpetuation of the cycle.
Dieser Knoten hat uns allen das Leben geschenkt. Und wir sind seine Bewahrung. Wir sind das Schicksal.
If all being must be a being towards death, then that is the sacrifice which must be made.
Auf jede Dunkelheit folgt Licht. Auf jeden Tod folgt ein Leben.
Even her own death is confirmation of her triumph. However, in the end, it seems that Adam and annihilation prevail. The suffering that has plagued Vinden for an eternity vanishes in the ultimate act of kindness. Only the denial of their own desire could allow Marta and Jonas to cross worlds and prevent the single tragedy from which all others sprung. But what to make of this?
Ich hatte so ein eigenartiges Gefühl. Als ob das gut ist. Dass alles vorbei ist. Als ob man plötzlich frei ist von allem. Kein Wollen. Kein Müssen. Unendliche Dunkelheit.
Are we done striving? Done suffering? After all, we could in some sense say that a car accident caused the apocalypse. Won't we always struggle against fate's cruel game and our allotment of death? After we've looked into the abyss, after we've tasted the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, can we ever really go back to just being?